A weathered chest unearthed from the fertile soil of a struggling family farm, containing secrets that would redefine our understanding of the American Civil War's most pivotal moments. A collection of battlefield journals and coded messages that challenged everything historians thought they knew about underground resistance movements and forgotten heroes. One determined single mother's accidental discovery while desperately trying to save her family's land that would bring university professors, Smithsonian curators, and government officials racing to a rural county within hours. This is the extraordinary, true story of how Margaret Collins's routine spring plowing revealed classified Civil War communications that had remained hidden for over 150 years, threatening powerful historical narratives and the reputations of families who had shaped the official account for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The antique wall clock in Margaret Collins's farmhouse kitchen chimed 4:30 a.m., though she had already been awake for nearly an hour, methodically reviewing her planting schedule over a steaming mug of homemade herbal tea. At 38, the former elementary school teacher's hands showed the calluses and weathering of 3 difficult years working the land. Having traded her classroom for this challenging agricultural existence following her husband's sudden death and the economic necessity that followed. The kitchen table was covered with seed catalogues, equipment rental invoices, and bank statements, each highlighting the precarious financial situation she faced with the historic Rivers Bend farm in Halston County. Margaret's long auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face showing both determination and fatigue as she studied the latest foreclosure warning from Midland Agricultural Bank. The letter gave her 60 days to make substantial payment on her loan or face loss of the property that had been in her late husband's family for 4 generations. Thomas had been gone from her life for 3 years now, their 15-year marriage ending when a farming accident claimed his life, leaving her alone to raise their 2 children, maintain the 120-acre farm, and somehow manage the crushing debt that had accumulated. Just 8 weeks. Margaret whispered to herself, glancing at the faded photograph of her husband's grandfather standing proudly beside the first tractor purchased for the farm in 1937. The image showed a prosperous operation that had once sustained 3 families, a stark contrast to her current struggle to keep the property productive with outdated equipment and limited help. The bank assessment recommended selling half the acreage immediately, but Margaret had fought against this option, unwilling to fragment the historic farm despite the financial logic. Her determination to preserve this legacy for her children, 13-year-old Emma and 10-year-old James, drove her to work hours that stretched from pre-dawn to well past sunset. Outside, the early April fog drifted across the eastern fields that had lain fallow for 2 planting seasons. The morning light revealed the ambitious undertaking Margaret had planned, bringing an additional 30 acres back into production this year, a necessary expansion if she hoped to generate enough income to satisfy the bank's demands. Her neighbors had offered to help, but most were facing their own economic challenges in a county where small family farms were increasingly being purchased by large agricultural corporations. Margaret finished her tea and moved to the window, watching as her old farm dog Cooper emerged from his sleeping spot on the porch to investigate something in the misty field. Despite the overwhelming challenges, she felt a powerful connection to this land, its seasonal rhythms, its history, the way it had sustained her family through previous hardships, including the Great Depression and the farming crisis of the 1980s. "Mom, you're up early again." Emma's voice came from the kitchen doorway, her teenager's typical sleepiness temporarily replaced by concern. "Just planning, honey," Margaret replied, forcing brightness into her voice. "Today's the day. We start bringing the East Field back. Big day." Emma's eyes, so like her father's, registered understanding beyond her years. "I can skip soccer practice this afternoon to help." Margaret crossed the room and wrapped her daughter in a hug. "Absolutely not. I've got Mr. Henderson coming with his tractor until noon, and your education and activities come first. That was the deal when we decided to keep the farm, remember?" The truth was more complicated. Margaret had been determined that her children would not sacrifice their childhood to the farm's demands, as she had seen happen to other families. The delicate balance between preserving their normal adolescent experiences and the realities of their financial situation created constant tension in her decisions. Emma nodded against her shoulder. "James and I can at least help sort through whatever you plow up. Last time, there were some pretty cool arrowheads." The previous year's ploughing of the North Field had indeed yielded an impressive collection of Native American artifacts that the local historical society had helped authenticate. The modest stipend they had provided for preserving these items had paid for 2 months of Emma's braces. "Deal," Margaret agreed, "but homework comes first." After ensuring both children had proper breakfasts and were aboard the school bus, Margaret returned to the kitchen to finish preparations for the day's work. The rental agreement for Mr. Henderson's more powerful tractor had consumed most of her emergency fund, a calculated risk that would allow her to prepare the eastern field in 2 days, rather than the week it would take with her own aging equipment. The farm had been in the Collins family since 1851, established by Thomas's great-great-grandfather, Augustus Collins, following his return from gold prospecting in California. According to family law, Augustus had used his modest mining success to purchase the fertile river bottomland, choosing agricultural stability over the boom and bust cycle of prospecting. The property had thrived during the Civil War years, remaining productive while many surrounding farms struggled with labor shortages and economic disruption. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The historical connection was a point of pride for the family, but it hadn't impressed the bank loan officers, who saw only declining agricultural margins and outdated infrastructure. Margaret had supplemented the farm income with substitute teaching and selling handcrafted preserves at the county farmers market, but these efforts merely slowed rather than reversed their financial decline. Margaret pulled on her worn work boots and heavy canvas jacket against the morning chill, her movements efficient from years of similar preparations. The weathered barn that housed her elderly tractor and limited equipment stood as testament to generations of Collins farmers, its hand-hewn beams dating to the farm's establishment. The property's rich history had become both Margaret's burden and her motivation. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she crossed the yard to meet Mr. Henderson, whose significantly more powerful John Deere was just pulling into the farm's entrance lane. The spring birds called from the old oak trees that lined the property's boundaries, their songs a reminder of the natural cycles that continued regardless of human struggles. "Morning, Maggie," called Henderson, a 60-something neighbor whose own farm had been sold to developers 5 years earlier. He now made ends meet by contracting his equipment and expertise to remaining farmers. His weathered face carried the permanent tan of decades working outdoors. "Ready to wake up that eastern section?" Margaret nodded, climbing into the passenger side of the tractor cab. "More than ready. That field's been sitting far too long." Henderson engaged the tractor's powerful engine, and they made their way across the property to the eastern section, a 30-acre expanse that bordered Sawyer Creek. The field had historically been the farm's most productive, its soil enriched by the creek's seasonal flooding, but Thomas had been preparing to plant it the season of his accident, and Margaret hadn't had the resources to maintain it since. "This was smart," Henderson commented as they approached the field. "This soil's some of the best in the county. Shame to leave it fallow." Necessity more than wisdom, Margaret admitted. The bank wants to see immediate expansion of production. This field should yield faster than bringing marginal land into rotation. Henderson nodded, understanding. The struggles of small family farms were all too familiar in Halston County, where agricultural conglomerates now owned nearly 70% of previously family-held farmland. They began the methodical process of preparing the field, Henderson operating the powerful tractor while Margaret walked behind, assessing soil conditions and removing larger debris that might damage the equipment. The work was physically demanding, but offered a meditative quality that Margaret had come to appreciate. The simple focus on immediate tasks providing temporary relief from the larger anxieties about the farm's future. By mid-morning, they had completed nearly a quarter of the field, the freshly turned soil dark and promising in the strengthening spring sunlight. Margaret paused to drink from her water bottle, surveying their progress with satisfaction. The productive morning had begun to kindle fragile hope that her ambitious planting plan might succeed. Henderson brought the tractor to a stop at the edge of a slight rise in the field. "Want to take over for a bit?" he called, knowing Margaret's pride in handling all aspects of the farm operations. Margaret nodded appreciation, climbing into the operator's seat while Henderson took a break beneath the shade of a boundary oak. She engaged the machine with practiced confidence, guiding it along the planned furrows with precision born of necessity rather than extensive experience. Thomas had been teaching her the finer points of large equipment operation before his accident, lessons she had continued through trial and error and occasional guidance from neighbors like Henderson. As the plow blade cut into a previously undisturbed section of the field, Margaret felt an unusual resistance, followed by a distinctive metallic scraping sound that immediately caused her to disengage the equipment. Unexpected obstructions could cause expensive damage to the rented tractor, a risk she couldn't afford. "Problem?" Henderson called, moving toward the tractor with the experience of someone who had encountered every possible farming setback. "Hit something," Margaret replied, carefully backing the tractor away from the obstruction. "Sounds like metal, not rock." Henderson reached the area and knelt to examine the partially exposed object. "Huh. That's odd. Looks manufactured, not just some old farm equipment fragment." Margaret joined him, her curiosity piqued. The ploughing had revealed what appeared to be a corner of a metal container of some kind, its surface darkened with age, but showing distinct right angles that suggested deliberate construction rather than random debris. "Old toolbox, maybe?" Margaret suggested, though the location, far from any existing or historical farm buildings, made this unlikely. Henderson shook his head, using his hands to carefully clear additional soil from around the exposed section. "More substantial than that, and intentionally buried from the look of it. See how the soil stratification changes here. Someone dug this in. It didn't just get covered over time." Margaret's farming experience had given her a practical understanding of soil patterns, and she immediately recognized what Henderson was indicating. The distinct change in soil coloration and composition clearly showed a historical disturbance, a deliberate pit that had been refilled. "Could it be hazardous?" she asked, suddenly concerned about potential chemical containers or other dangerous materials that might have been improperly disposed of in earlier eras when environmental regulations were minimal. Henderson examined the visible portion more carefully. "Don't think so. Construction seems too old-fashioned for modern chemicals. Actually reminds me of military containers from back in my army days, but much older design." This statement immediately captured Margaret's full attention. The Collins family history included military service dating back to the Civil War, with Augustus Collins having reportedly served briefly before establishing the farm. Various military artifacts had been discovered on the property over generations, including uniform buttons and a corroded bayonet that now hung in the farmhouse dining room. "Let's excavate it properly," Margaret decided, her educator's appreciation for historical artifacts overriding the day's agricultural agenda. If it is something historical, I don't want to damage it with the equipment. The next hour was spent carefully removing soil from around the mysterious object, using hand trowels and brushes that Margaret retrieved from the barn. Their methodical approach gradually revealed a substantial metal chest, approximately 3 feet long by 2 feet wide, its construction suggesting military design from the mid-19th century. The chest featured reinforced corners and a flat top with a complex locking mechanism that had long since corroded into inoperability. Unlike a standard footlocker or storage trunk, the container appeared to have been designed for document storage, with special sealing features that would have provided protection from moisture and environmental damage. Civil War era, if I had to guess, Henderson commented, his interest clearly piqued by their discovery. My grandfather collected military artifacts, had a few document cases similar to this from that period. The design is distinctive. Margaret carefully brushed away the remaining soil from the chest's surface, revealing faded lettering stenciled. Across the top, CMSR VA7SC, followed by a series of numbers that had become illegible through corrosion. The official military appearance of the markings lent credence to Henderson's assessment of the chest's origins. This isn't just some random storage box, Margaret noted, excitement building despite her practical nature. This was intentionally buried, well away from any building foundations or known structures. Henderson nodded agreement. And buried. Deep too. Probably wouldn't have found it without the deep plowing you're doing. Regular cultivation wouldn't have reached this depth. The implications began to register with Margaret. The eastern field's position near Sawyer Creek made it a natural landmark, one that would have been recognizable even as surface structures changed over generations. If someone had deliberately buried an official military container in this specific location, they had intended for it to remain hidden while still being potentially recoverable, using the creek and property boundaries as reference points. "Should we try to open it here?" Henderson asked, the question bringing Margaret's racing thoughts back to practical considerations. She assessed the situation carefully. The chest appeared intact despite its long burial, and moving it risked damage to whatever contents might have survived. However, proper examination would require better tools and controlled conditions than they could manage in the middle of the field. "Let's bring it to the barn," she decided. "I want to document this properly before attempting to open it." Together, they carefully extracted the chest from its resting place, finding it surprisingly heavy despite its modest dimensions. The weight suggested contents more substantial than paper documents, increasing Margaret's curiosity about what might have been considered valuable enough to conceal so deliberately. They transported the chest to the barn using the small utility trailer, creating a makeshift examination area on a sturdy workbench that Thomas had built for equipment repairs. Margaret took numerous photographs with her smartphone, documenting the chest from multiple angles before attempting any further intervention. "Mind if I call Ben Harper?" Henderson asked, referring to the local high school history teacher who also served as volunteer curator for the county's small historical museum. "He'd know better than either of us how to handle something like this properly." Margaret hesitated, briefly. Her financial circumstances made her instinctively cautious about sharing the discovery until she understood its significance and potential value. The farm's precarious situation had created a constant calculation of resources and opportunities that influenced every decision. However, her respect for historical preservation outweighed these concerns. "Good idea," she agreed, "but let's keep this quiet otherwise until we know what we're dealing with." While Henderson made the call, Margaret examined the chest more carefully under the barn's good lighting. The construction was indeed military grade from the Civil War period, with heavy-gauge metal reinforced at stress points and specialized sealing features around the lid's perimeter. The stenciled markings were consistent with official Confederate military document designations, specifically the compiled military service record system established for administrative purposes. Most intriguingly, the lock mechanism, while corroded, showed signs of deliberate tampering rather than simple degradation. Someone had apparently attempted to secure the chest with additional measures beyond the standard military locks, suggesting contents of unusual sensitivity or value. Margaret's teaching background included American history, and she had a particular interest in the Civil War period that had developed through researching her husband's family connections to the conflict. Margaret Collins had established the farm shortly before the war began and had reportedly served briefly before returning to agricultural production. Family lore included mentions of the farm's role in supplying Confederate forces, though details had become blurred through generations of retelling. "Ben's on his way," Henderson reported, returning from his call. "Says to not attempt opening it until he arrives. Apparently, the wrong approach could damage fragile contents." Margaret nodded agreement, her educator's respect for historical artifacts overriding her curiosity. "Did you mention the military markings?" "Yes, that's what got him particularly interested. Says the CMSR designation is significant, especially with the VA-7 code. Something about Virginia's 7th Regiment having unusual historical gaps in their documentation." This information heightened Margaret's excitement about their discovery. Historical significance potentially translated to institutional interest, and possible financial compensation through proper archaeological channels. While she would never compromise historical preservation for personal gain, the farm's desperate circumstances made her acutely aware of the practical dimensions of any unexpected discovery. Within 30 minutes, Ben Harper's decade-old Subaru was pulling into the farm's entrance lane, dust billowing behind it, suggesting a speed uncommon for the normally reserved history teacher. Margaret had known Ben professionally during her teaching years and respected his dedication to local history, though his academic enthusiasm sometimes exceeded his social awareness. "Margaret, Jim, this is potentially extraordinary," Harper called as he hurried toward them, equipment bag in hand, his lanky frame and prematurely gray hair giving him the stereotypical appearance of an academic, despite his high school teaching position. A Civil War document chest with CMSR VA markings found on original Collins property. The historical implications are significant. His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, momentarily allowing Margaret to set aside her financial worries and embrace the historical discovery's intrinsic value. Harper had dedicated his career to preserving Holston County's rich historical narrative, often with minimal resources or recognition. "We haven't attempted to open it," Margaret explained, as Harper examined the chest with evident reverence. "Thought it best to wait for expert guidance." "Absolutely correct," Harper confirmed, his inspection methodical and careful. "Moisture damage is the primary concern with buried documents. Opening the container incorrectly could cause catastrophic deterioration to contents that have reached an environmental equilibrium." He continued his examination, documenting measurements and markings in a small notebook while occasionally photographing specific features with a professional camera. His practice movements suggested experience with historical artifacts beyond what might be expected of a high school teacher. "The CMSR VA-7SC designation is particularly significant," Harper explained as he worked. "These refer to compiled military service records for Virginia's 7th Special Commission. This wasn't a standard regiment, but a specialized intelligence unit that operated with unusual autonomy, reporting directly to the Confederate Secretary of War rather than through normal military channels." Margaret's historical knowledge included recognition of the basic organizational structure of Confederate forces, but this specialized unit wasn't something she had encountered in standard historical accounts. "I've never heard of this commission in any Civil War histories." Harper nodded, his expression reflecting academic excitement. "Few have. Their operations were deliberately obscured even during the period, and most official records were allegedly destroyed during Richmond's fall. In 1865, historians have debated their actual activities for decades with limited primary source documentation. If this chest contains original commission documents..." He paused, seemingly overwhelmed by the possibility. It would be an extraordinary contribution to Civil War scholarship. The historical significance of their discovery was becoming increasingly apparent, transforming what had begun as an agricultural setback into something potentially momentous. Margaret found herself mentally calculating how to balance this unexpected development with the day's necessary farm work, her practical concerns competing with genuine historical interest. "What's the proper next step?" she asked, preferring to establish a clear process rather than allowing enthusiasm to drive potentially damaging haste. Harper considered this question with appropriate seriousness. "Ideally, we would transport this to a controlled environment with proper humidity management and specialized tools for conservation-safe opening. However," he hesitated, clearly weighing professional best practices against practical limitations. "The county museum lacks those facilities, and transportation itself poses risks without specialized equipment." He continued examining the chest, focusing particularly on the corrosion patterns around the sealing mechanisms. The good news is that this design included advanced moisture protection for field conditions. The sealing compound along this channel would have created a remarkably effective barrier. Given the depth of burial and soil composition in this area, there's reasonable hope that the contents remain at least partially preserved. The barn doors opened again, admitting afternoon sunlight and revealing Emma and James, recently returned from school. Their expressions reflected immediate curiosity about the gathering, an unfamiliar object commanding the adults' attention. "What did you find?" Emma called, approaching with the confidence of early adolescence, her brother following more cautiously behind. Margaret beckoned them closer, recognizing a valuable educational opportunity despite her instinct to protect them from potential disappointment. "Mr. Henderson and I found this chest buried in the East Field. Mr. Harper thinks it might be from the Civil War." Both children's eyes widened, their interest immediately captured. James moved to touch the chest, but stopped himself without prompting, displaying the careful respect for historical items that Margaret had instilled through previous discoveries on the property. "Is it treasure?" he asked, his 10-year-old imagination readily conjuring romantic possibilities. "Historical treasure, perhaps," Harper replied with the engaging tone that made him a beloved teacher despite his academic intensity. "This chest was designed for military documents, not gold or valuables, but historical documents can be even more valuable than physical treasure because they tell us stories we've forgotten." Emma, more pragmatic like her mother, immediately grasped potential implications. If it's really important, would there be a reward? Could it help with the bank? The directness of her question reflected the family's openness about their financial challenges, a parenting decision Margaret had made to prepare her children for potential difficult transitions rather than sheltering them from reality. The same question created momentary discomfort for Harper and Henderson, who were aware of the Collins family's circumstances but unaccustomed to such frank acknowledgement from a 13-year-old. "Historical artifacts work differently than found valuables, Emma," Margaret explained gently. "They belong to our shared heritage, But yes, proper archaeological discoveries can sometimes include finder compensations or institutional grants. For preservation, that's not our primary concern right now, though. Harper nodded appreciation for Margaret's balanced response before returning to the practical challenge before them. I believe we can attempt a controlled opening here if we're careful. The alternative is waiting for potential institutional involvement, which could take days to arrange. The academic suggestion surprised Margaret, who had expected a more conservative approach given the potential historical significance. Are you sure that's wise? I don't want to risk damaging something important. Harper's expression reflected careful consideration. Normally, I would absolutely recommend waiting for specialized conservation teams. However, two factors influence my thinking. First, the excellent seal design and burial conditions suggest potentially viable preservation, but environmental exposure, now that it's been removed from stable conditions, creates new risks with each passing hour. Second, the historical significance of potential commission documents warrants expedited examination. He removed specialized tools from his equipment bag, cotton gloves, small prying implements designed for conservation work, humidification, tools, and photographic equipment. I've worked with similar artifacts through my summer fellowship at the State Historical Society. We can document the opening process properly while minimizing exposure risks. His careful preparation reassured Margaret, and she nodded agreement. The children were positioned at a respectful distance, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid accidentally interfering with the delicate process. Henderson volunteered to continue the field preparation while the historical examination proceeded, an offer Margaret gratefully accepted. Over the next 40 minutes, they watched as Harper methodically addressed the chest's sealing mechanisms, applying controlled humidity to loosen corrosion without shocking the internal environment. His techniques reflected professional training beyond his position as a high school teacher, revealing a depth of specialized knowledge that impressed even the practically minded Margaret. "Almost there," Harper murmured, working on the final locking mechanism. "The seals have maintained remarkably well. That's extremely promising for content preservation." With careful pressure on specialized tools, the chest's lid finally released with a soft sound that suggested an intact vacuum seal had been maintained across the decades. Harper paused to document this significant detail before proceeding, his academic thoroughness evident in every step. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at Margaret for final permission before proceeding. She nodded, aware they were potentially about to view documents unseen for over 150 years. The historical significance of the moment was not lost on her, despite the practical concerns that dominated her daily existence. Emma and James had fallen completely silent, their usual restlessness temporarily forgotten in the anticipation of historical discovery. With careful movements, Harper gradually raised the chest's lid, revealing an interior that appeared remarkably well preserved. The contents had been organized with military precision: leather document portfolios, sealed correspondence packets, and several small wooden boxes with brass fixtures. Most significantly, the documents showed minimal deterioration, their preservation far exceeding reasonable expectations for buried materials of this age. "Extraordinary," Harper whispered, his academic composure momentarily overcome. "The preservation quality is museum grade. The sealing technology was remarkably effective." The uppermost item was an official-looking envelope sealed with wax, bearing a distinctive insignia, crossed sabers beneath a star. With gloved hands, Harper carefully lifted this envelope and examined the seal without breaking it. "Confederate Secretary of War's office seal," he identified, his voice reflecting controlled excitement. This would have been high-level correspondence, possibly from Secretary Seddon himself, based on the time period. Beneath this envelope lay a leather portfolio labeled Operation Evergreen, Field Communications, in faded but legible handwriting. The military precision of the organization suggested these weren't merely administrative records, but operational documents of significant strategic importance. Harper carefully photographed each item's position before removal, creating a detailed record of the original arrangement that would have archaeological significance beyond the document's content. His methodical approach demonstrated respect for historical context that transcended mere curiosity about the information contained within. The initial examination revealed a collection far more significant than even Harper had anticipated. The chest contained what appeared to be the complete operational records of a specialized Confederate intelligence unit, including coded field communications, agent identifications, and operational directives signed by high-ranking officials, including the Confederate Secretary of War and, most surprisingly, notes bearing President Jefferson Davis's signature. "This is unprecedented," Harper explained, his academic excitement barely contained. The Special Commission's activities were deliberately obscured in official records. Historians have debated their actual operations for generations with minimal primary source evidence. These documents could fundamentally transform our understanding of Confederate intelligence operations and potentially several key battle outcomes that have historical irregularities. As Harper carefully examined individual documents, a narrative began emerging that suggested historical significance beyond even these considerable contributions to Civil War scholarship. The Commission's activities appeared to have included operations that directly contradicted established historical accounts of certain key engagements, particularly regarding communication with Union officers and civilian authorities in border regions. Most significantly, one document portfolio contained correspondence regarding Northern sympathizer networks, apparent documentation of extensive civilian resistance activities within Confederate territories that had received minimal historical acknowledgement. These records included names, locations, and operational details of individuals who had opposed the Confederacy from within, often at tremendous personal risk. "This is historically transformative," Harper stated, carefully examining a coded message ledger. "The traditional narrative of unified Confederate civilian support has persistent gaps and contradictions that historians have questioned for generations. These documents suggest organized internal resistance networks far more extensive than conventionally acknowledged." The academic significance was clearly substantial, but Margaret found herself drawn to the human dimension represented by these documents. Individuals who had made difficult moral choices during national conflict, their actions subsequently minimized or erased from historical acknowledgement. As an educator, she had always emphasized the importance of understanding history's complexity rather than accepting simplified narratives. While Harper continued his initial documentation, Margaret stepped outside the barn to check Henderson's progress with the field preparation. The practical demands of the farm hadn't disappeared despite the historical discovery, and the day's agricultural objectives remained essential to their financial survival. "Making good progress," Henderson called from the tractor, gesturing toward the significant portion of the field he had completed during the historical examination. "Should finish before sundown at this rate." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for his understanding of her situation, the simultaneous excitement of historical discovery and pressure of agricultural necessity. The community support, represented by neighbors like Henderson, had sustained her family through their most difficult periods following Thomas's death. "Ben thinks the documents are significantly important," she explained, raising her voice to be heard over the tractor's engine. Something about Confederate intelligence operations and civilian resistance networks. Henderson nodded thoughtfully. Not surprising, really. This area had complicated loyalties during that period. My own great-great-grandfather supposedly helped Union sympathizers escape north, despite officially supporting the Confederate cause. Those stories get passed down quietly in families, even when official histories ignore them. This perspective reminded Margaret of the gap between institutional historical narratives and the complex realities preserved through family oral traditions and local knowledge. Her own husband's family had maintained stories about Augustus Collins that suggested a more complicated relationship with Confederate authorities than simple support. Those specifics had faded through generations. As she returned to the barn, Margaret heard Harper speaking urgently on his phone, his tone reflecting controlled excitement rather than concern. "Yes, Professor Marshall. Original commission documents with Secretary Seddon's authentication. Oui, extensive documentation of the Evergreen Network. Civilian resistance coordination with specific names and locations. No. Remarkably well preserved given the circumstances." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Harper providing additional details about the discovery circumstances and initial document assessment. The academic's growing excitement suggested the historical significance exceeded even his initial evaluation, with potentially transformative implications for Civil War scholarship. "That was Dr. Elizabeth Marshall at State University," Harper explained after ending the call. "She's the leading authority on Confederate civilian networks and irregular operations. She's actually canceling a conference presentation to drive here tonight with proper conservation equipment. This discovery is potentially landmark, Margaret." The academic validation confirmed what had become increasingly apparent through their initial examination. The chest contained historical documentation of exceptional significance that would interest major institutional partners. For Margaret, this represented both exciting historical contribution and potential practical opportunities for the farm's preservation. "What happens next?" she asked, her practical nature focusing on process rather than speculation. Harper outlined the standard archaeological protocols for significant historical discoveries, explaining how academic institutions, state historical societies, and potentially federal agencies would collaborate on proper documentation, preservation, and eventual public access. The process typically included formal assessment of historical significance, professional conservation, institutional acquisition negotiations, and academic publication. The finder, that's you, Margaret, maintains certain rights throughout this process, Harper explained. State laws and ethical archaeological standards include provisions for finder compensation, preservation grants, and recognition in subsequent academic work. Given the apparent significance of these materials, those considerations would be substantial. This information provided Margaret both reassurance and new considerations. The potential for institutional support offered unexpected possibilities for the farm's preservation, though she remained cautious about allowing financial considerations to overshadow proper historical stewardship. As evening approached, Margaret arranged for the secure overnight storage of the chest and its contents in the farm's small office, which could be properly locked and monitored. Harper provided specialized preservation materials to maintain appropriate humidity levels until Professor Marshall arrived with professional conservation equipment. After Harper departed, promising to return early the following morning with Marshall, Margaret gathered her children for their evening meal. The day's unexpected developments had disrupted normal routines, but maintaining stability for Emma and James remained her highest priority despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Is the treasure going to save the farm, Mom?" James asked, as They sat at the kitchen table, his question reflecting both childhood hopefulness and awareness of their precarious situation. Margaret considered her response carefully, balancing honest assessment with appropriate optimism. "It's not treasure. In the way you're thinking, James. It's historical documents that help us understand our past better. But yes, important historical discoveries can sometimes bring resources that help preserve the places where they're found. We'll see what happens." Emma, more perceptive to adult complexities, asked the more difficult question. "If the documents are really important, will they take them away? Will we get to keep anything?" "Historical artifacts belong to everyone," Margaret explained, drawing on her teaching background. "They need proper preservation in museums or archives where people can learn from them. But the people who find them and the places where they're discovered become part of that history too. Our farm will be connected to whatever stories these documents tell." As the children prepared for bed, Margaret returned to the kitchen table, where the bank notices still lay among her agricultural planning materials. The day's historic discovery had temporarily overshadowed, but not eliminated, the farm's immediate financial challenges. The 60-day deadline remained unchanged, regardless of archaeological excitement. Margaret found herself in the complex position of navigating both immediate agricultural necessities and unexpected historical significance. The practical farmer and the former educator experienced different responses to the day's developments, creating internal tension between enthusiasm for historical discovery and pragmatic concern for her family's security. Outside, the spring night had settled over Rivers Bend Farm, the stars emerging above fields that had sustained the Collins family through generations of challenges. Margaret stepped onto the porch, listening to the familiar chorus of spring peepers from the creek and watching the silhouette of the barn, where a historical treasure had unexpectedly emerged from the earth that afternoon. Whatever developments the morning might bring with Professor Marshall's arrival, Margaret recognized that her fundamental responsibilities remained unchanged, preserving her family's legacy, providing stability for her children, and maintaining the farm that connected past generations to future possibilities. The historical discovery had not altered these core obligations, but potentially offered new pathways toward fulfilling them. In the quiet darkness, Margaret found herself contemplating Augustus Collins's decisions during another period of national division and uncertainty. The farm's founder had navigated Civil War complexities while establishing an agricultural legacy that had sustained his family for generations. Now, over 150 years later, documents he may have known about or even helped conceal had emerged from his land, creating new possibilities at another critical moment in the farm's history. The coincidence seemed almost too perfect to be merely chance, as if the land itself had preserved these historical truths until the moment they might serve both historical understanding and the farm's continued existence. Margaret was not generally given to romantic notions, but the timing of this discovery during their most desperate financial crisis suggested a connection across generations that transcended simple explanation. As she finally prepared for sleep after this extraordinary day, Margaret realized that the chest's contents represented more than historical artifacts. They embodied human choices made during difficult circumstances, preserved for future understanding. Across centuries, whatever institutional processes might follow, this fundamental human connection between past decisions and present possibilities had already transformed her relationship with both the farm's history and its uncertain future. Margaret awoke before her alarm the following morning, the events of the previous day having disrupted her normal sleep pattern despite physical exhaustion. The bedside clock showed 4:17 a.m., and she allowed herself a few quiet moments to organize her thoughts before the demanding day ahead. The chest's discovery had created extraordinary circumstances, but the practical needs of the farm remained unchanged. The eastern field still required preparation. Spring planting couldn't be delayed, and the bank's 60-day deadline continued its relentless approach. Rising quietly to avoid waking her children, Margaret moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency. The kitchen calendar displayed multiple overlapping commitments: equipment rental return deadlines, her substitute teaching schedule, Emma's soccer tournament, and now, unexpectedly, historical assessment written in her neat handwriting across the day's box. As she prepared coffee, Margaret noticed headlights approaching along the farm's entrance lane, unusual for this pre-dawn hour. The vehicle moved slowly, suggesting unfamiliarity with the property, eventually parking near the farmhouse rather than proceeding to the barn, where the chest remained secured. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as a woman emerged, carrying specialized equipment cases despite the early hour. Opening the front door, Margaret called softly across the porch, "Professor Marshall, I assume? You're earlier than expected." The woman approached, her professional demeanor somewhat softened by evident excitement. In her 50s, with silver-streaked, dark hair pulled into a practical bun, she carried herself with the confident focus of someone accustomed to academic leadership. "Dr. Elizabeth Marshall," she confirmed, extending her hand. "I apologize for the unreasonable hour, but after reviewing Ben's photographs, sleep became impossible. The historical significance of these documents potentially transcends anything in my field for decades." Margaret welcomed the professor inside, appreciating her directness despite the intrusion on precious early morning quiet. "Coffee?" "God, yes," Marshall replied with unexpected informality. "I drove straight through from the conference in Richmond. The implications of these documents justified abandoning my keynote address to very disappointed colleagues." This acknowledgement of the discovery's exceptional significance validated the disruption to Margaret's agricultural schedule. As she poured coffee for them both, Marshall unpacked specialized equipment that suggested immediate examination rather than mere planning. "Ben explained your farm's situation," Marshall said carefully, addressing the financial context with professional sensitivity. "I want to be transparent about processes and possibilities so you can make informed decisions about these materials." Margaret appreciated this candid approach. "The farm's challenges don't change my commitment to proper historical handling, Professor, but understanding potential timelines and institutional involvement would certainly help my planning." Marshall nodded approval. That balanced perspective is unfortunately rare in significant discoveries. Too often, financial considerations overwhelm historical stewardship, or academic purists ignore legitimate finder interests. This mutual respect established, Marshall outlined her preliminary assessment based on Harper's documentation and photographs. The chest appeared to contain operational records from the Confederate Special Commission's intelligence network, including documentation of civilian resistance activities systematically excluded from official historical accounts. The preservation quality suggested documents had remained unexamined since burial, potentially offering unprecedented insights into suppressed historical narratives. If confirmed through proper authentication, these materials would constitute a landmark discovery, Marshall explained. The Commission's activities represented a critical intelligence function that influenced major military outcomes, while the civilian resistance networks they monitored have been systematically minimized in conventional historical narratives. This academic assessment aligned with Margaret's educator's understanding of how historical narratives often simplified complex realities, particularly regarding civilian experiences during conflict. Her teaching had always emphasized the importance of questioning established accounts and seeking multiple perspectives. As dawn light gradually illuminated the farmhouse kitchen, they discussed both historical implications and practical processes. Marshall explained how academic authentication would proceed, followed by institutional acquisition negotiations that would balance historical preservation with finder compensation considerations. State historical preservation statutes include specific provisions for agricultural discoveries, Marshall noted, her familiarity with relevant regulations suggesting previous experience with similar situations. The Historic Farmlands Conservation Program specifically addresses scenarios where significant historical materials are discovered during active agricultural operations. This information provided Margaret cautious optimism regarding potential resources for the farm's preservation, though she remained realistic about institutional timelines versus her immediate financial deadline. The 60-day bank requirement wouldn't adjust to accommodate academic authentication processes. By the time Emma and James appeared for breakfast, Marshall had established a makeshift conservation workspace on the dining room table, her equipment suggesting professional capabilities beyond typical academic research. The children regarded the professor with curious respect, their questions reflecting both historical interest and practical concerns about the farm situation. "Will the documents go in a museum?" James asked, his 10-year-old perspective focused on tangible outcomes. "Most likely a specialized archive for research access," Marshall explained without condescension. "Museums display artifacts, while archives preserve written materials for study. These documents would likely have elements in both settings eventually." Emma's question demonstrated her more developed understanding of their circumstances. "How long does it take? For the formal authentication and everything, we only have 60 days before the bank's deadline." The directness momentarily surprised Marshall, though she maintained professional composure. Authentication has preliminary and comprehensive phases. Initial assessment can be completed within weeks, while full academic authentication typically requires months. However, she added, noting Emma's expression, institutional involvement often begins based on preliminary findings, especially for discoveries of exceptional significance. This measured response provided realistic context, without false promises, an approach Margaret appreciated both as a parent and as someone navigating difficult financial realities. Marshall was neither dismissing legitimate practical concerns nor offering unrealistic assurances. After breakfast, they moved to the farm office where the chest remained secured. Margaret had maintained the preservation conditions Harper had established, ensuring stable humidity and temperature overnight. Marshall's expression reflected professional approval as she examined these arrangements before beginning her preliminary assessment. "You have natural conservation instincts," she commented, preparing specialized equipment for document examination. "Many academics develop these skills through training, but you've applied common-sense preservation approaches impressively." Margaret smiled slightly at this unexpected compliment. Teaching third graders develops practical problem-solving. Children have remarkable capacity for simultaneous creativity and destruction. Marshall's methodical examination process demonstrated specialized expertise beyond conventional academic research. Her tools included digital microscopy equipment, specialized lighting for non-invasive analysis, and conservation-grade handling materials that protected fragile documents while enabling thorough assessment. Each document underwent systematic documentation before careful removal for individual examination. "The preservation quality is exceptional," Marshall confirmed as her examination progressed. The specialized sealing technology in these military document chests was remarkably effective, particularly when combined with the stable environmental conditions of deep burial in this soil composition. Throughout the examination, Margaret alternated between observing the historical process and addressing essential farm operations. Henderson had arrived to continue the eastern field preparation, requiring coordination and periodic checking that maintained agricultural progress alongside the historical assessment. This dual focus represented the reality of her position, simultaneously responsible for historical stewardship and practical farm management. By mid-morning, Marshall's preliminary examination had confirmed Harper's initial assessment, while revealing additional dimensions of historical significance. The documents indeed included operational records from the Confederate Special Commission with authenticated signatures from senior leadership, including Secretary of War James Seddon and, most remarkably, President Jefferson Davis himself. These operational directives demonstrate direct presidential knowledge of civilian intelligence networks, Marshall explained, carefully examining a particularly significant document bearing Davis's distinctive signature. This contradicts the historical distancing narrative that has prevailed in academic understanding of Confederate intelligence operations. The operational records detailed an extensive monitoring system targeting suspected Union sympathizers within Confederate territories, including documentation of civilian resistance activities that had received minimal historical acknowledgement. Most significantly, the records included names, locations, and operational details of individuals who had opposed the Confederacy from within, often facing extreme personal risk. The Evergreen Network, referenced repeatedly in these documents, appears to have been a civilian resistance operation, far more extensive than conventionally acknowledged, Marshall noted, her academic excitement evident despite professional restraint. These materials suggest organized internal resistance extending throughout Virginia and into North Carolina, with connections to Union intelligence that influenced military outcomes at several key engagements. As Marshall continued her examination, Margaret was drawn to a leather portfolio labeled Holston County Operations, a direct connection to their specific location that suggested local historical significance beyond the broader Confederate intelligence context. This portfolio contained detailed documentation of civilian activities within the county, including suspected Union sympathizers, communication networks, and supply distribution operations. "This is extraordinary," Margaret commented, recognizing several family names that remained prominent in the county. "These are ancestors of people I know, neighbors, families from church, parents of my students." Marshall nodded, understanding. "Local operational documentation is exceptionally rare. Confederate authorities systematically destroyed regional intelligence records during Richmond's evacuation, particularly those identifying civilian networks. This level of specific local documentation is unprecedented in my research experience." As they carefully examined the local records, a familiar name suddenly appeared that caused Margaret to pause. Collins Augustus, Rivers Bend Farm, status monitored. "That's this farm," Margaret said, processing the implications. "Augustus Collins established Rivers Bend in 1851. He's my husband's great-great-grandfather." Marshall examined the entry with heightened interest. The designation "monitored" had specific meaning in Commission terminology. It indicated suspected but unconfirmed opposition activities, individuals under surveillance rather than confirmed network participants. Margaret studied the documentation with personal investment, beyond academic interest. Family stories had always mentioned Augustus's complicated relationship with Confederate authorities, though specifics had faded through generations of oral retelling. This written evidence suggested her husband's ancestor had operated under suspicion from Confederate intelligence, potentially engaged in resistance activities from this very property. Before they could explore this personal connection further, Marshall's attention was captured by a separate document section within the chest, a leather-bound journal with different handwriting than the official records. Unlike the military documentation, this appeared to be personal writing, potentially providing context beyond institutional records. "This is extremely significant," Marshall stated, carefully examining the journal. "Based on handwriting comparison, this appears to be the personal record of Major Thomas Hargrove, who served as Regional Commission Director for this operational sector." Private journals from intelligence officers are exceptionally rare, particularly with operational context. The journal's initial entries confirmed this assessment, detailing Hargrove's appointment to the Commission in 1863 and his assignment to the Western Virginia sector following previous intelligence experience. His writing revealed a complex perspective, and professional commitment to Confederate military objectives, combined with growing personal discomfort regarding civilian surveillance activities and punishment operations against suspected Union sympathizers. Entry after entry documented the ethical tensions experienced by an intelligence officer caught between military duty and moral reservations. Hargrove's writing revealed increasingly explicit concerns about commission practices, particularly the treatment of civilians based on sometimes limited evidence. Most significantly, later entries documented his deliberate information filtering, selectively reporting civilian activities to protect individuals he believed were unjustly targeted. This journal provides unprecedented insight into the moral complexities experienced by Confederate intelligence officers, Marshall explained, her academic assessment integrating both historical significance and human dimension. Hargrove appears to have engaged in increasingly deliberate protection of certain monitored civilians, including, she paused, locating a specific entry, including Augustus Collins of Rivers Bend Farm, whom he describes as a man of principle, operating from conscience rather than disloyalty. This direct connection between Margaret's family property and the historical materials transformed her relationship with the discovery. The chest wasn't merely significant historical documentation, but potentially her husband's ancestors' direct experience. The farm's founder operating under Confederate surveillance while apparently receiving some protection from a conflicted intelligence officer. The final journal entries revealed the most significant historical revelation. In March 1865, as Confederate military position deteriorated, Hargrove documented receiving orders to eliminate evidence of commission operations, particularly civilian surveillance records that might expose Southern citizens to retribution following anticipated Union victory. His journal expressed explicit moral objection to destroying documentation that might later exonerate wrongfully accused individuals. The final entry, dated April 9th, 1865, the day of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, described Hargrove's decision to preserve rather than destroy his operational records. "I cannot in good conscience eliminate evidence that might later provide justice for those wrongfully suspected. Neither can I expose these materials to immediate discovery and the certain retribution that would follow. I have therefore secured these records where they might eventually serve historical truth once present passions have cooled. May God forgive any failures of duty this decision represents." Marshall's expression reflected the extraordinary significance of this documentation. This appears to explain the chest's burial on Collins' property. Hargrove chose preservation over destruction, deliberately securing these materials where they might eventually be discovered after immediate conflict tensions had subsided. Indeed, the implications extended beyond academic historical significance to fundamental questions about moral choice during conflict. An intelligence officer choosing conscience over absolute loyalty, preserving truth despite professional obligation, protecting civilians from unjust accusation despite potential personal consequences. He buried them here deliberately, Margaret realized, the historical narrative clarifying. not randomly but specifically on Riversbend property. The journal mentions Augustus Collins receiving some protection from Hargrove. There was a connection between them. Marshall nodded, reviewing additional documentation that supported this interpretation. The operational records include multiple instances where Hargrove appears to have redirected suspicion from Collins despite surveillance reports. This suggests a personal relationship beyond professional interaction. This historical revelation created a profound connection across generations. Augustus Collins and Major Hargrove engaged in a complex moral negotiation during national conflict, their decisions preserved in documentation that emerged more than 150 years later at another critical juncture for the Collins family farm. As their examination continued, a vehicle approaching the farm drew Margaret's attention to the window. Instead of Ben Harper's expected arrival, she saw an unfamiliar black SUV with government plates, followed by a university vehicle, proceeding with deliberate purpose toward the farmhouse. "Are you expecting colleagues?" Margaret asked, the formal appearance of the approaching vehicles creating uncertainty about appropriate response. Marshall glanced outside, her expression reflecting recognition rather than surprise. Not specifically, but not unexpected either. Word travels quickly in specialized academic circles, particularly for discoveries of this significance. The lead vehicle parked precisely in the farm's circular drive, and two individuals in professional attire emerged. A tall woman with the composed authority of senior leadership and a younger man carrying specialized equipment. Their coordinated movements and formal demeanor suggested government representatives rather than typical academic researchers. The second vehicle yielded 3 additional visitors, 2 carrying equipment cases marked with university insignia, and an older gentleman whose distinguished appearance and confident bearing suggested considerable academic authority. Margaret experienced momentary unease at this unexpected convergence of officials at her property, a reaction born from years of navigating institutional interactions while protecting her family's interests. The formal arrival of multiple authorities suggested the historical discovery had already triggered official processes beyond her immediate control. The knock at the door carried unmistakable authority, despite its professional restraint. Marshall moved toward the entrance with Margaret, her academic standing potentially providing helpful intermediary presence during these introductions. "Dr. Marshall, your departure from the conference created quite the ripple," the distinguished older gentleman called as they opened the door, his tone suggesting collegial familiarity despite the formal circumstances. When the words "authentic commission documents" circulate, certain institutional attention becomes inevitable. "Professor Whitmore," Marshall acknowledged, her tone balancing professional courtesy with territorial academic caution. "I might have expected you'd appear with remarkable speed. Margaret Collins, allow me to introduce Dr. James Whitmore, Chair of Civil War Studies at National University and apparently now traveling with federal representatives." The tall woman stepped forward, producing credentials confirming an unexpected institutional connection. "Catherine Bennett, Historical Authentication Division, National Archives. These materials potentially constitute federally significant historical documentation requiring specialized preservation protocols." This introduction created immediate context for the formal arrival, national institutional interests activating in response to the discovery, bringing both academic authority and federal oversight to the farmhouse. The implication that specialized divisions existed specifically for such discoveries suggested established protocols beyond typical historical research. "May we come in?" Bennett requested, her tone making it clear this was procedural courtesy rather than genuine question. We understand you've discovered Confederate intelligence documentation, potentially including direct presidential authorization materials. Margaret recognized the shifting dynamics created by these arrivals, her private farm property temporarily transformed into a confluence of academic, federal, and personal interests centered on historical materials with unexpected significance. The institutional representatives projected authority that might easily overwhelm individual priorities without careful navigation. "Of course," she replied, stepping back to allow their entrance while maintaining composed presence, rather than yielding control of the situation. "Professor Marshall has been conducting preliminary authentication this morning. We've been documenting everything according to proper historical protocols." Bennett nodded professional acknowledgement. "Excellent. Dr. Marshall's reputation for methodological rigor is well established. This will streamline the transition to formal authentication protocols." The visitors entered Margaret's modest farmhouse, their specialized equipment and formal demeanor creating striking contrast with the practical agricultural setting. The institutional representatives efficiently assessed the space, identifying the farm office as the current document location with the practiced awareness of professionals trained for similar situations. "Ms. Collins," Bennett began as they moved toward the office, "the Historical Authentication Division operates specifically for rapid response to discoveries of exceptional historical significance. These materials potentially constitute federally protected documentation, requiring specialized conservation and security protocols." This formal language carried clear institutional authority, but also potential implications for Margaret's relationship with these materials. The suggestion of federal jurisdiction potentially affecting both access considerations and compensation possibilities. Before she could formulate an appropriate response, Professor Whitmore intervened with academic perspective. "The historical significance of commission documentation cannot be overstated," he explained, his demeanor suggesting someone accustomed to academic authority. "Confederate intelligence operations have represented a persistent historical gap due to systematic record destruction. Authenticated commission materials would constitute landmark documentation affecting numerous historical narratives." As the group entered the farm office, where the chest and partially examined contents remained secured, Dr. Marshall subtly positioned herself beside Margaret, creating scholarly alliance that provided counterbalance to the institutional presence. This wordless support communicated professional respect that strengthened Margaret's position despite the authority convergence in her modest farm office. "I've completed preliminary authentication of approximately 30% of the materials," Marshall reported professionally. "Initial findings confirm commission operational documentation, including authenticated Seddon and Davis signatures. Most significantly, the collection includes Major Hargrove's personal journal, providing unprecedented context for commission operations and civilian monitoring activities." Bennett's attention focused immediately on the materials, her assessment, reflecting specialized training beyond conventional historical research. Original document chest with military-grade preservation features, apparent unbroken soil context until recent discovery. Consistent materials degradation patterns suggesting authentic period documentation rather than later reproduction. Preliminary indicators support potential authentication. This initial assessment triggered coordinated activity among the institutional representatives, specialized photography, environmental monitoring, security assessment, and documentation protocols implemented with practiced efficiency that transformed the farm office into an impromptu historical laboratory. "Ms. Collins," Bennett addressed Margaret directly while her colleagues established their equipment. Discoveries of this significance activate established protocols balancing historical preservation with finder interests. The Historical Authentication Division coordinates comprehensive assessment while ensuring appropriate recognition of private discovery circumstances. This formal language addressed procedural elements while carefully avoiding specific commitments regarding either institutional acquisition or finder compensation. The professional neutrality suggested practice communication designed to establish authority without creating definitive expectations. Margaret recognized the importance of maintaining active participation rather than passive observation as these institutional processes unfolded. Her teaching background had developed skills navigating educational bureaucracy while advocating for student interests, experience that proved relevant in this unexpected historical negotiation. "I appreciate the historical significance of these materials," she responded, matching Bennett's professional tone while establishing her own informed perspective. "As both the property owner and someone with educational background, I'm committed to proper historical preservation while understanding the documentation's connection to this specific property and my family's history." This balanced statement established Margaret's position as informed participant rather than passive observer, asserting legitimate interests without challenging institutional authority directly. Her reference to educational background subtly established relevant credentials beyond property ownership, while mentioning family historical connection created personal dimension beyond legal considerations. Bennett acknowledged this perspective with professional respect. Family historical connections often provide valuable context for discovery circumstances. Initial assessment suggests these materials may have specific relevance to this property's Civil War period activities. Before this conversation could develop further, Professor Whitmore interjected with academic enthusiasm, having reviewed Marshall's preliminary documentation. "The Hargrove Journal is extraordinary. Personal moral reflection from commission leadership provides unprecedented insight into intelligence operations. This challenges fundamental narratives about civilian experience in Confederate territories." His scholarly excitement momentarily overshadowed institutional procedures, creating space for historical content to take precedence over jurisdictional considerations. Marshall leveraged this opening to guide attention toward the document's historical significance rather than procedural authority, describing the journal's documentation of Hargrove's ethical struggles regarding civilian surveillance. The journal directly references Augustus Collins of Riversbend Farm, Marshall explained, indicating the relevant entry. Margaret's husband's great-great-grandfather appears to have been under commission surveillance while receiving some protection from Hargrove, who questioned the legitimacy of civilian targeting practices. This personal connection immediately transformed institutional dynamics, shifting focus from abstract historical significance to human dimension that connected past decisions directly to present circumstances. Bennett's expression reflected recognition of how this personal element complicated standard procedural approaches, introducing considerations beyond typical institutional protocols. "Your family's direct historical connection adds significant context," she acknowledged, her professional tone softening slightly. The Historical Authentication Division considers established historical relationships when determining appropriate handling for privately discovered materials. Margaret recognized this subtle shift as potential opportunity to ensure her family's interests remained central despite institutional processes. The direct connection between Augustus Collins and the discovered materials created legitimate historical relationship beyond simple finder circumstances. "The chest appears to have been deliberately buried on Collins' property by Major Hargrove," she noted, drawing attention to the journal's final entry. Not random happenstance, but intentional preservation connected specifically to this farm. That historical choice seems relevant to current considerations. Professor Whitmore nodded enthusiastic agreement, academic interest temporarily overshadowing institutional affiliations. Absolutely relevant. Hargrove's deliberate selection of Collins' property suggests historical relationship beyond documented surveillance. The preservation intent specifically connected to this location creates exceptional historical continuity between documentation and discovery site. This academic validation strengthened Margaret's position without directly challenging institutional authority, creating scholarly support for the farm's historical significance beyond bureaucratic procedures. As the initial assessment continued, the relationship between historical content and discovery location became increasingly central to the developing narrative. The authentication team worked with practiced efficiency, creating comprehensive documentation of the chest and contents while maintaining appropriate preservation conditions. Their specialized equipment and coordinated procedures suggested experience with similar situations despite the ostensibly rare nature of such significant historical discoveries. Throughout this process, Margaret maintained active engagement, balancing observation of proper historical procedures with attention to her property's practical context. The unexpected convergence of institutional interests had temporarily transformed her struggling farm into an impromptu historical laboratory, creating opportunities but also potential complications for her immediate agricultural responsibilities. As initial authentication procedures progressed, Margaret excused herself briefly to check Henderson's progress with the eastern field preparation. The day's historical developments hadn't eliminated her practical agricultural obligations, and maintaining this balance demonstrated both responsibility to the historical discovery and commitment to the farm's continued operation. "Quite the collection of official vehicles," Henderson commented as she approached the field edge, where he had made significant progress despite the day's distractions. Word travels fast in historical circles, apparently. Margaret nodded, appreciating his understanding of the situation's complexity. National Archives representatives, university researchers, and possibly more arriving. The documents appear more significant than we initially realized. Direct presidential authorization materials and intelligence operations specifically connected to this property. Henderson whistled low appreciation. Historical jackpot from an academic perspective. Any indication how this affects your practical situation? 60 days doesn't allow much cushion for institutional timelines. This direct reference to her financial deadline reflected Henderson's practical farmer's perspective, cutting through academic excitement to the concrete realities facing Riversbend Farm. His question articulated concerns Margaret had been balancing. Throughout the morning's developments, the uncertain relationship between historical significance and immediate practical necessities. "Too early for definitive answers," she replied honestly. "Historical significance is clearly established with direct connections to Augustus Collins and this specific property. That creates stronger position regarding finder considerations, but institutional processes have their own timelines." Henderson nodded understanding, his expression reflecting both hope and pragmatic caution. "Well, they're certainly taking it seriously based on that equipment parade. Haven't seen that much official interest in Holston County since the governor visited during the flood recovery." This observation highlighted the exceptional nature of the institutional response, suggesting potential opportunities beyond typical historical discovery circumstances. The rapid convergence of national-level authorities indicated significance that might translate to expedited processes despite typical bureaucratic timelines. As Margaret returned to the farmhouse, she observed additional vehicles arriving. University transportation, now joined by local media representatives drawn by the unusual activity at River's Bend. The historical discovery was rapidly transforming, from private agricultural circumstance to public event, with potential consequences beyond her immediate control. This evolving situation would require careful navigation balancing historical responsibility, family interests, and immediate agricultural necessities. The chest had remained buried for over 150 years before emerging at this critical juncture for the Collins family farm. Timing that suggested purpose beyond coincidence, connecting past preservation choices to present possibilities through generations of agricultural stewardship. As Margaret approached the farmhouse, she noticed the local news van had positioned itself strategically at the property entrance, a reporter already preparing for a live segment. The swift transition from private discovery to public interest created immediate concerns about information control and potential impact on her children returning from school later that afternoon. Their lives had already experienced enough disruption without becoming impromptu media subjects. Catherine Bennett intercepted Margaret before she reached the reporters, demonstrating situational awareness that transcended bureaucratic stereotype. "Ms. Collins, our office can establish appropriate media protocols if you'd prefer. Historical discoveries of this significance naturally attract attention, but property owner privacy remains respected under our standard procedures." The offer reflected professional courtesy that acknowledged Margaret's position beyond mere procedural consideration. "I appreciate that," she responded, glancing toward the road where additional vehicles were arriving. "My children will be home from school soon, and they've already experienced significant life changes without adding media exposure." Bennett nodded understanding, immediately activating a coordinated response that reflected practiced institutional preparation for such circumstances. Within minutes, her colleagues had established an information staging area at the property entrance, redirecting media representatives away from the residents while providing basic authenticated information that satisfied immediate journalistic requirements without compromising historical integrity. This efficient management of external interest allowed the authentication process to continue without disruptive intrusions. Inside the farmhouse, Professor Whitmore and Dr. Marshall had established complementary examination protocols that balanced academic thoroughness with preservation priorities, their scholarly competition temporarily superseded by professional collaboration toward comprehensive documentation. "The organization system is military standard, but includes personalized annotation," Marshall observed, indicating Hargrove's handwritten notations throughout otherwise standardized documentation. "This creates exceptional historical value, institutional records contextualized through individual perspective." Whitmore nodded enthusiastic agreement. Hargrove appears to have maintained parallel documentation, official reports alongside personal assessment. The disparities between these records reveal systemic information filtering that challenges fundamental historical understandings of Confederate intelligence reliability. Their academic excitement remained focused on historical significance, rather than institutional competition, creating scholarly environment that prioritized comprehensive understanding over professional territory. This collaborative approach benefited both historical documentation and Margaret's position, establishing multiple academic perspectives that strengthened the discovery's significance beyond single institutional interpretation. As afternoon approached, Bennett coordinated a formal briefing that included all present authorities, acknowledging Margaret's central position both physically and procedurally. Preliminary authentication, confirms these materials constitute historically significant documentation of Confederate Special Commission operations, including verified leadership authorization. The collection additionally contains unique personal documentation providing unprecedented operational context. This official assessment established validated historical significance without overstating authentication certainty, maintaining procedural integrity while confirming exceptional historical value. Bennett's precise language reflected institutional thoroughness without unnecessary bureaucratic qualification, providing clear validation that would support subsequent processes regarding both preservation and finder considerations. Based on preliminary assessment, these materials warrant comprehensive authentication through the National Historical Documentation Protocol, Bennett continued, referencing established procedures that balanced institutional interests with discoverer rights. This process includes full conservation assessment, historical contextualization, and appropriate determination regarding permanent preservation considerations. Margaret recognized the institutional language contained both professional thoroughness and deliberate procedural flexibility, establishing formal process without predetermining specific outcomes regarding either acquisition or compensation. This balanced approach respected both historical significance and legitimate finder interests, creating foundation for subsequent negotiations rather than imposing predetermined institutional conclusions. The protocol includes specific provisions for agricultural discovery circumstances, Bennett added, addressing practical aspects that acknowledged Margaret's situation beyond general finder considerations. The Historical Farmlands Preservation Initiative specifically addresses discoveries with direct historical connection to active agricultural properties. This reference to specialized provisions created potential path connecting historical significance to Margaret's immediate practical challenges, suggesting institutional frameworks that might address both preservation requirements and farm sustainability needs. The acknowledgement of agricultural context demonstrated institutional awareness beyond abstract historical consideration, recognizing the farm's continued operation as legitimate factor in comprehensive resolution. Before further discussion could develop, Emma and James arrived home from school, their expressions reflecting immediate awareness of the transformed circumstances surrounding their family farm. The presence of official vehicles, unfamiliar equipment, and controlled media activity created unmistakable evidence that their mother's discovery had escalated beyond initial understanding. "Mom, what's happening?" Emma asked, her adolescent perception immediately identifying the situation's significance beyond normal farm activities. "There are news vans at the end of the driveway, and Mrs. Peterson said something about historical treasure on our property during history class." The rapid community awareness demonstrated both small-town information networks and the discovery's inherent public interest, creating immediate family implications beyond institutional processes. Margaret had hoped to manage this transition more gradually, providing appropriate context before external influences shaped her children's understanding of their suddenly transformed circumstances. "The documents we found yesterday have significant historical importance," Margaret explained, guiding her children into the kitchen, away from the authentication activities. "Experts from universities and the National Archives are documenting everything properly. It's creating more attention than we expected, but we're managing it responsibly." Emma's perceptive gaze moved between her mother's composed expression and the official activities visible through the window, her 13-year-old assessment encompassing both excitement and concern. "Is this going to help with the bank deadline? Jessica's family lost their farm last year, and there wasn't anything they could do to stop it." The direct reference to their precarious circumstances reflected the maturity Margaret had cultivated in her children through honest communication about their challenges. Rather than sheltering them from difficult realities, she had included age-appropriate understanding that prepared them for potential outcomes while maintaining hopeful perspective. The historical significance creates possibilities we didn't have yesterday, Margaret acknowledged, balancing honest assessment with appropriate optimism. But these processes have their own timelines that don't necessarily align with bank deadlines. We're exploring all options while continuing our original plan for the Eastern Field expansion. This response respected her children's capacity for complex understanding while avoiding either unrealistic promises or unnecessary pessimism. The discovery had created potential opportunities without guaranteeing specific outcomes, a nuanced reality that required both hope and practical continuation of established responsibilities. James, typically less focused on practical matters than his sister, asked the question that reflected his 10-year-old perspective. Will we be in history books now since our farm had secret Civil War stuff? This innocent inquiry captured a fundamental aspect of their changing circumstances. The Collins family farm had suddenly acquired historical significance beyond personal or local meaning, potentially entering broader historical narrative through this unexpected discovery. Their private family property had become connected to national historical understanding in ways that transcended ordinary agricultural identity. The farm will certainly become part of historical records, Margaret confirmed, recognizing the personal significance this represented for her children. Rivers Bend has always been important to our family, but now historians will recognize its role in preserving these documents across generations. That's something special that connects us to the past in a new way. This perspective offered meaningful context beyond financial or institutional considerations, acknowledging how the discovery created legacy connection that enriched their family identity regardless of practical outcomes. The farm's historical significance had been enhanced in ways that transcended property valuation or agricultural production, creating heritage dimension that would persist beyond immediate circumstances. As Margaret helped her children settle into afternoon routines, accommodating the unusual activities while maintaining normal household patterns, Bennett approached with update regarding authentication progress. We've completed initial documentation of approximately 60% of the materials, with consistent validation of authentication indicators. The preliminary findings warrant activation of the expedited historical assessment protocol, given the exceptional historical significance. This procedural advancement represented institutional recognition exceeding standard historical discovery, acknowledging importance that justified accelerated processes rather than conventional timelines. The formal designation created potential pathway addressing Margaret's practical time constraints while maintaining appropriate authentication thoroughness, balancing procedural integrity with exceptional circumstances recognition. The protocol includes provisions for site-specific historical designation when discovery location maintains direct connection to documented historical activities. Bennett continued, introducing procedural element with particular relevance to Margaret's situation. Preliminary evidence strongly supports historical operational connection between these materials and Rivers Bend Farm specifically. This assessment created foundation for potential designation that would recognize the farm's historical significance beyond merely discovery location, establishing documented connection between the property and Civil War activities that warranted preservation consideration. Such designation could potentially access specialized resources, addressing both historical preservation and agricultural continuation, providing institutional framework connecting academic significance to practical sustainability. The historical Authentication Division coordinates with the Agricultural Heritage Preservation Office regarding properties with dual historical and agricultural significance, Bennett explained, referencing institutional collaboration that addressed Margaret's specific circumstances. Their representative will join us tomorrow to conduct preliminary site assessment regarding potential designation eligibility. This development represented meaningful procedural advancement beyond generic historical discovery, establishing specialized pathway, addressing both the document's historical significance and the farm's agricultural heritage. The institutional acknowledgement of these complementary values created potential framework, connecting historical preservation to farm sustainability, addressing Margaret's immediate challenges through established programs rather than exceptional accommodation. As afternoon transitioned toward evening, the authentication teams established overnight security procedures that respected both historical preservation requirements and family privacy considerations. The coordinated departure of most personnel, with minimal essential staff remaining for document security, demonstrated institutional awareness of the farm's continued functioning beyond historical laboratory. After ensuring her children had completed homework and settled into evening activities, Margaret joined Dr. Marshall for comprehensive review of the day's findings. Unlike the institutional representatives, with their necessarily divided attention among procedural, security, and authentication concerns, Marshall maintained primary focus on historical content and its significance beyond bureaucratic classification. The materials document three distinct narrative threads of exceptional historical significance, Marshall explained, her academic enthusiasm balanced with recognition of Margaret's personal interest. First, the operational documentation provides unprecedented insight into Confederate intelligence practices, including direct presidential authorization of civilian surveillance activities previously minimized in historical accounts. This assessment established baseline historical significance beyond disputed interpretation, confirming documentary evidence that would fundamentally revise established historical understanding regardless of institutional perspectives. The presidential authorization documentation alone warranted significant historical attention, creating foundation for legitimate institutional interest, regardless of additional elements. Second, the civilian resistance documentation provides extensive evidence of organized opposition networks operating within Confederate territories, Marshall continued, indicating materials that recorded activities, participants, and operational methods of Southern civilians who had opposed Confederacy from within. This challenges persistent historical narratives about unified Confederate civilian support, documenting extensive internal resistance that has received minimal historical acknowledgement. This element addressed fundamental historical revision beyond military operations, documenting civilian experience that had been systematically minimized in conventional historical accounts. The extensive documentation of named individuals, specific activities, and organized networks provided evidence supporting historical understanding that acknowledged complexity beyond simplified narratives about unified Confederate support. Finally, and most relevant to your specific circumstances, the Hargrove Journal provides extraordinary personal documentation connecting these broader historical patterns directly to Riversbend Farm, Marshall concluded, highlighting the personal documentation that established direct historical relationship beyond coincidental discovery location. Augustus Collins appears repeatedly as someone under commission surveillance while receiving deliberate protection from Hargrove himself, suggesting relationship beyond typical operational interaction. This third element created direct connection between historical significance and Margaret's family property, establishing documented relationship that transcended simple discovery circumstances. The deliberate burial location, combined with documented connection between Hargrove and Augustus Collins, created historical relationship specific to Riversbend Farm, potentially supporting specialized designation acknowledging this historical continuity. Hargrove's final journal entry explicitly states his decision to preserve rather than destroy these materials, choosing burial at a location he considered trustworthy, Marshall noted, indicating specific documentation supporting intentional preservation rather than random concealment. This deliberate historical choice creates extraordinary continuity between original documentation and discovery circumstances after more than 150 years. This interpretation supported conceptualization beyond coincidental discovery, suggesting historical intention that connected past preservation decision to present circumstances through generations of agricultural continuity. The documented relationship between Hargrove, Augustus Collins, and Riversbend Farm established historical narrative connecting the buried materials specifically to this property rather than arbitrary concealment location. From purely historical perspective, these materials would warrant significant institutional interest regardless of discovery circumstances, Marshall concluded, providing objective assessment beyond personal connection. The addition of documented historical relationship between these specific materials and your family property creates exceptional circumstances that transcend standard discovery protocols. This evaluation provided Margaret both academic validation and practical foundation for subsequent discussions regarding appropriate resolution, establishing historical significance that warranted both institutional preservation and recognition of specific discovery circumstances. The documented connection between Riversbend Farm and these historical materials created legitimate basis for specialized consideration beyond generic finder circumstances. As evening settled over the property, the remaining authentication personnel maintained discreet presence that respected family privacy while ensuring appropriate document security. The transformed circumstances had temporarily converted portions of the working farm into historical laboratory, creating unusual convergence between agricultural operation and historical preservation that mirrored the property's documented historical role. After ensuring her children had settled for the night, Margaret stepped onto the farmhouse porch, seeking momentary solitude to process the day's extraordinary developments. The spring evening carried familiar agricultural scents, freshly turned soil from the eastern field, blooming orchard trees along the property's western boundary, the distant sweet hay fragrance from neighboring farms, connecting present circumstances to the generations of Collins farmers who had worked this land since Augustus established Riversbend during another period of national transition. The remarkable convergence of circumstances struck Margaret with renewed clarity. Major Hargrove choosing this specific property to preserve historical truth during one national crisis, those materials emerging generations later during another critical juncture for the Collins family farm. The timing suggested purpose beyond coincidence, as if the land itself had preserved these materials until their discovery might serve both historical understanding and the farm's continued existence. As Margaret contemplated these connections, Ben Harper's vehicle approached the farmhouse, the local history teacher having been notably absent during the day's institutional activities despite his initial involvement. His expression as he approached the porch suggested both excitement and apology, his typically reserved academic demeanor temporarily overtaken by genuine enthusiasm. "Margaret, I'm sorry for disappearing today," he began, joining her on the porch with visible excitement despite the evening hour. When the institutional representatives arrived, I recognized the discovery had exceeded local historical society capabilities, but I've spent the day researching something potentially relevant to your specific situation. His focused purpose suggested findings beyond general historical interest, addressing practical aspects that institutional representatives might consider secondary to authentication protocols. Margaret welcomed this perspective that prioritized local impact over national historical classification, potentially offering insights connecting academic significance to community context. The Historical Farmlands Preservation Initiative has specific provisions for properties with documented historical significance beyond agricultural production, Harper explained, referencing program details beyond Bennett's general mention. When original historical activities directly connect to continued agricultural operation, specialized designation becomes available that addresses both preservation and sustainability requirements. This specific information provided concrete pathway connecting historical significance to Margaret's immediate challenges, offering established program rather than uncertain special consideration. The initiative's explicit recognition of complementary values between historical significance and agricultural continuation created potential framework addressing both preservation requirements and farm sustainability needs. Properties receiving this designation become eligible for specialized financing programs that prioritize continued agricultural operation while supporting appropriate historical preservation, Harper continued, explaining practical implications beyond academic designation. The programs specifically address transition challenges for family farms with documented historical significance, providing resources maintaining agricultural continuity rather than conversion to static historical sites. This approach directly addressed Margaret's fundamental concern, preserving the farm as functioning agricultural operation rather than sacrificing either historical integrity or practical sustainability. The specialized designation acknowledged complementary rather than competing values between historical significance and continued farming, offering resources supporting both dimensions rather than prioritizing one over another. I've assembled preliminary application materials based on public historical records, Harper concluded, providing practical assistance beyond academic guidance. With the documented connection between these materials and Riversbend specifically, the application can be completed incorporating authentication findings without delaying submission timelines. This practical support demonstrated community engagement transcending institutional processes, offering local knowledge that complemented national expertise without challenging official protocols. Harper's focused research addressing Margaret's specific circumstances provided valuable connection between abstract historical significance and concrete local implementation, creating potential pathway addressing immediate challenges through established programs rather than uncertain special consideration. As they discussed specific application requirements and potential timelines, Margaret recognized how the historical discovery had activated multiple support dimensions extending beyond institutional processes alone. The local community represented by Harper, neighboring farmers like Henderson, and emerging public interest created complementary resources alongside official protocols, establishing comprehensive support framework rather than isolated institutional response. This multidimensional activation reflecting the farm's integrated identity within both historical and community contexts. Riversbend wasn't merely agricultural property with coincidental historical connection, but living embodiment of continued stewardship, connecting Augustus Collins's establishment through generations of family farming to present circumstances. The historical materials had emerged at this critical juncture, not through random chance, but through convergence of preservation intention and continued agricultural commitment across 150 years of unbroken stewardship. The evening conversation with Harper created hopeful pathway connecting historical significance to practical sustainability, offering established programs rather than uncertain special consideration. This perspective maintained focus on the farm's continued operation while acknowledging its historical significance, providing framework that recognized complementary values rather than competing priorities between preservation and agricultural production. As Harper departed with specific plans for tomorrow's application development, Margaret remained briefly on the porch, contemplating the extraordinary transformation of circumstances within just 48 hours. The desperate plowing of fallow fields to satisfy bank requirements had revealed historical materials that potentially offered pathway preserving both the farm's agricultural future and its historical significance, connecting past preservation, choices to present possibilities through generations of continued stewardship. The eastern field that had represented desperate financial gamble now embodied both agricultural renewal and historical revelation, its freshly turned soil simultaneously preparing for future crops and revealing long-preserved historical truth. This dual significance reflected Riversbend's integrated identity beyond simple classification, as either agricultural property or historical site, embodying continuous relationship between land stewardship and historical preservation across generations. The remarkable timing, documents emerging precisely when their discovery might influence the farm's preservation, suggested purpose beyond coincidence, connecting Major Hargrove's preservation choice during one national crisis to the Collins family's sustainability challenges during another period of agricultural transition. This convergence created powerful narrative extending beyond academic classification to fundamental questions about responsible stewardship across generations, whether preserving historical truth or maintaining working agricultural land. As Margaret finally moved inside, prepared for another early morning balancing farm responsibilities with historical protocols, she recognized that regardless of specific outcomes, the discovery had already transformed Riversbend's identity in ways that transcended financial valuation. The farm had acquired documented historical significance, acknowledging its role preserving important historical truth across generations, creating legacy dimension that enriched family heritage regardless of immediate practical resolution. This perspective provided foundation for addressing tomorrow's challenges with renewed purpose beyond mere financial necessity. Riversbend Farm represented continuous commitment spanning from Augustus Collins's establishment through her husband's generations to her own stewardship responsibility, connecting historical preservation with agricultural continuation through unbroken chain of family dedication. The emergence of these historical materials at this critical juncture offered potential pathway honoring both dimensions of this legacy, preserving working farm while acknowledging its documented historical significance. 6 months later, the morning frost glittered across Riversbend Farm's eastern field, transforming the harvested rows into silver ribbons stretching toward the creek boundary. Margaret Collins paused at the field's edge, steam rising from her coffee mug as she surveyed the transformed landscape that had yielded both historical revelation and the farm's most productive harvest in 15 years. The October dawn light illuminated the property's dual identity, working agricultural operation and nationally recognized historical site that had evolved through extraordinary transformation rather than compromise. The renovated barn that now housed the Riversbend Historical Center stood as physical embodiment of this integrated identity, its original agricultural structure carefully preserved, while interior modifications created appropriate space for educational exhibits and research activities. Unlike conventional historical sites that prioritize preservation over functionality, Riversbend maintained working agricultural operation alongside historical programming, creating living demonstration of continued stewardship rather than static. Monument to past activities. "Morning, Ms. Collins," called Dr. Jason Reynolds, the center's resident historian, as he approached along the frost-covered path between field and barn. His presence represented institutional commitment beyond mere document acquisition, establishing continuous research program that maintained historical significance while respecting agricultural operations. The university students arrive at 9 for the agricultural history practicum. Should I redirect them from the North Field since you're harvesting there today? This practical question reflected the carefully balanced relationship that had developed between historical programming and agricultural operations, maintaining both activities through coordinated planning rather than competing priorities. Unlike conventional approaches that might have prioritized either preservation or production, Riversbend had established integrated operations that recognized complementary rather than competing values. "The harvesting creates perfect demonstration opportunity," Margaret replied, her practical farmer's perspective complementing academic programming rather than opposing scholarly activities. "We can incorporate working demonstration if you'll adjust your schedule to start there. The students should see actual production alongside historical context." Reynolds nodded appreciation for this integrated approach. "Perfect teaching opportunity. I'll revise the schedule to begin with active harvesting observation before transitioning to historical documentation. The practical connection strengthens academic understanding." This collaborative exchange represented the farm's transformed operations, neither sacrificing agricultural productivity for historical programming nor compromising historical integrity for farming convenience. The discovery that had emerged from the eastern field 6 months earlier had catalyzed comprehensive transformation that preserved both dimensions through innovative integration rather than prioritizing either value alone. As Reynolds returned to the barn to prepare for the day's educational activities, Margaret continued her morning inspection of the property, the established routine now encompassing both agricultural assessment and historical site maintenance. The carefully restored farmhouse retained primary function as family residence, while accommodating occasional historical tours focusing on Augustus Collins's establishment period. This balanced approach maintained family privacy while acknowledging the property's documented historical significance. The morning light revealed evidence of the property's transformed circumstances. New equipment storage buildings constructed with architectural features honoring original farm structures, irrigation systems that incorporated historical watershed, patterns documented in Hargrove's materials, educational signage discreetly positioned to enhance visitor understanding without disrupting agricultural functionality. These integrated elements reflected comprehensive approach that preserved working farm identity while acknowledging historical significance. Margaret's morning circuit brought her to the Memorial Garden, established near the Eastern Fields Discovery Site, a thoughtfully designed space that honored both the historical documentation and the individuals whose experiences it had preserved. Unlike conventional historical monuments focusing exclusively on prominent figures, this garden acknowledged the civilian networks documented in the recovered materials. Ordinary individuals who had maintained moral courage during extraordinary conflict despite minimal historical recognition. The garden's centerpiece featured simple granite marker with inscription drawn from Hargrove's journal. "Truth preserved through generations finds its moment of recognition when most needed." This philosophical perspective had proven remarkably prescient, given how the document's emergence had transformed Riversbend's circumstances precisely when their discovery might prevent the farm's loss, connecting historical preservation with contemporary continuation through timely revelation. As Margaret contemplated this connection, Emma approached along the garden path, her school backpack indicating preparation for regular educational routine despite the farm's transformed circumstances. At 14, she had navigated the property's dramatic transition with remarkable adaptability, maintaining normal adolescent activities while embracing new responsibilities connected to Riversbend's enhanced significance. "Mum, we're presenting our community history projects today," she reminded, her expression reflecting genuine engagement rather than obligatory participation. "I've included the oral history recordings from Mr. Henderson's grandfather about local resistance networks. Is it okay if I bring my group here after school to see the actual documents?" This request demonstrated how the historical discovery had created educational opportunities extending beyond conventional classroom experiences, connecting standard curriculum with living historical resources that enhanced understanding through direct engagement. Emma's genuine interest reflected personal connection, transcending academic requirement, recognizing her family's place within continuing historical narrative rather than separate from documented events. "Check with Dr. Reynolds about researcher scheduling," Margaret advised, maintaining appropriate boundaries between family residence and educational facility despite their integrated operation. "The university team is documenting the Halston County Materials section today, but the main exhibition area should be available for student groups." This practical guidance reflected established protocols balancing public educational access with necessary research activities, creating sustainable operational framework rather than prioritizing either function exclusively. The Historical Center maintained regular educational programming while supporting continuing scholarly research, creating dynamic historical engagement rather than static preservation alone. As Emma departed for school, Margaret continued toward the farm's western section, where James was already assisting Henderson with equipment preparation for the day's harvesting. At 11, he had embraced the farm's agricultural operations with enthusiasm enhanced rather than diminished by its historical significance, finding connection between contemporary farming activities and generations of Collins family stewardship, documented through historical materials. "We're using the new combine today," James asked eagerly as Margaret approached, his expression reflecting excitement about agricultural operations rather than historical programming, despite the property's dual identity. "Mr. Henderson says it's twice as efficient as the old equipment." This enthusiasm demonstrated the balanced priorities, maintaining Riversbend's primary identity as working family farm despite its enhanced historical significance. Unlike conventional approaches that might have converted agricultural property into static historical site, the specialized designation had provided resources maintaining modern farming operations alongside appropriate historical preservation. The new equipment supports both production efficiency and conservation methods documented in the historical materials, Henderson explained, his continuing presence representing community connection, transcending initial discovery circumstances. The Historical Agricultural Commission specifically recommended these models for maintaining authentic farming lineage while incorporating modern sustainability practices. This integrated approach exemplified Riversbend's transformed operations, neither rejecting modern agricultural methods for historical authenticity nor abandoning traditional practices for production efficiency alone. The specialized designation had provided resources supporting modernization that maintained historical continuity through sustainable methods rather than static preservation, creating evolutionary continuation rather than artificial historical snapshot. As morning activities established productive rhythm balancing agricultural operations with historical programming, Margaret observed Ben Harper's vehicle approaching along the entrance lane, his regular Tuesday visit representing continuing local engagement beyond initial discovery involvement, his weekly contributions coordinating educational programming between local schools and the historical center maintained community connection, ensuring Riversbend's significance extended beyond academic interest to meaningful local impact. "Morning, Margaret," Harper called as he approached the equipment area, carrying materials for the afternoon's teacher workshop. The Middle School History Curriculum Committee approved the Riversbend Case Study Unit for next semester. All 8th graders will participate in the Hidden Histories program using primary sources from the collection. This educational development represented meaningful community impact beyond academic research value, creating opportunities for young people to engage with historical complexity through direct primary source experience rather than simplified textbook narratives. The approved curriculum would reach hundreds of local students annually, transforming understanding of regional history through materials that had remained hidden for generations before emerging from Riversbend's eastern field. The teaching materials emphasize critical thinking about historical narrative construction, Harper continued, displaying curriculum resources that focused on analytical skills rather than mere content memorization. Students will examine how certain experiences remained undocumented in conventional historical accounts despite extensive contemporary evidence. This educational approach addressed fundamental historical understanding beyond specific Civil War content, developing critical assessment skills applicable across historical periods and contemporary information evaluation. The curriculum utilized Riversbend's materials to develop transferable analytical abilities rather than isolated historical knowledge, creating educational value transcending specific historical period or regional significance. As Harper proceeded toward the historical center to prepare for afternoon programming, Margaret continued her morning oversight of the property's integrated operations. The carefully balanced schedule maintained agricultural productivity while accommodating educational activities, creating a sustainable model that preserved working farm identity alongside historical significance, rather than sacrificing either dimension. By mid-morning, university students had arrived for their agricultural history practicum, their engaged participation demonstrating academic interest, extending beyond document analysis to practical understanding of continued agricultural operations. Unlike conventional historical research focused exclusively on documentation, this program integrated historical materials with continued farming practices, examining evolutionary development rather than isolated historical snapshot. Dr. Elizabeth Marshall, whose initial authentication involvement had expanded into continuing research partnership, led the university group with an approach that respected both academic rigor and practical agricultural operations. Her specialized focus on civilian documentation had developed into a comprehensive research program examining how preserved materials transformed historical understanding through recovery of previously minimized experiences. Today's session examines how agricultural practices documented in the Hargrove materials reveal continuous adaptation rather than static historical methods, Marshall explained to her students as they gathered near the active harvesting demonstration. Riversbend provides unique opportunity to observe evolutionary continuation, connecting historical documentation with contemporary implementation. This integrated educational approach exemplified the property's transformed identity, neither artificial historical recreation, nor completely modernized operation disconnected from historical practices. The specialized designation had provided resources supporting continuity through evolution rather than static preservation, maintaining authentic agricultural lineage through adaptive continuation rather than artificial historical snapshot. As the morning's coordinated activities demonstrated Riversbend's successful integration of historical significance with agricultural continuation. Margaret received notification that representatives from the Historical Agricultural Commission were arriving for their scheduled 6-month assessment. These periodic evaluations maintained program accountability while providing opportunity to demonstrate successful implementation, justifying continued resource allocation. Catherine Bennett, whose initial involvement representing the National Archives had expanded into continuing advisory role with the Commission, led the assessment team with approach balancing necessary oversight with program development support. Her expression as she approached Margaret near the Historical Center entrance reflected professional assessment rather than bureaucratic inspection, suggesting collaborative evaluation rather than adversarial compliance review. Riversbend continues. Setting implementation standards for the integrated preservation model, Bennett observed, her clipboard containing preliminary assessment notes indicating comprehensive review rather than superficial inspection. The operational balance between agricultural production and historical programming demonstrates program objectives more effectively than anticipated during initial designation. This professional validation confirmed Riversbend's successful implementation exceeding baseline requirements, establishing exemplary model rather than merely satisfactory compliance. The farm's innovative integration, maintaining both agricultural productivity and historical programming, created operational framework that preserved authentic identity while acknowledging documented significance. The Commission particularly notes the educational programming's community integration, Bennett continued, referencing extensive local participation extending beyond conventional historical tourism. The coordination with regional educational institutions creates impact exceeding typical historical site visitation patterns, establishing meaningful community engagement rather than isolated preservation alone. This assessment acknowledged Riversbend's community significance beyond academic historical value, recognizing educational impact, creating broader understanding rather than specialized scholarly interest alone. The integrated programming connecting local schools, regional universities, and community organizations established comprehensive engagement, ensuring the historical materials influence contemporary understanding rather than merely preserving isolated historical documentation. As the assessment team continued their evaluation through comprehensive property tour, Margaret recognized how completely Riversbend's circumstances had transformed within 6 months of the Eastern Field discovery. The desperate plowing of fallow acreage to satisfy bank requirements had revealed historical materials that catalyzed comprehensive transformation, preserving both the farm's agricultural identity and its documented historical significance through specialized designation, providing resources addressing both dimensions. The Historical Farmlands Preservation Initiative had provided immediate debt restructuring, addressing the bank's 60-day deadline through specialized agricultural heritage provisions, converting financial liability into sustainable preservation, commitment with realistic operational parameters. Unlike conventional historical designation that might have prioritized preservation over functionality, this specialized program acknowledged agricultural continuation as essential component, requiring operational resources beyond basic historical maintenance. The financial reorganization had included equipment modernization grants supporting continued agricultural productivity alongside preservation requirements, providing resources, maintaining competitive farming operations rather than merely historical appearance. This practical support ensured Riversbend maintained economic viability through real agricultural production rather than becoming dependent on historical programming alone, preserving authentic farm identity through continued operational productivity. Most significantly, the initiative had established endowed educational programming ensuring historical significance extended beyond preservation alone to meaningful community engagement, creating sustained impact through generations rather than temporary historical interest. This educational dimension transformed the historical materials from isolated documentation to continuing influence on contemporary understanding, fulfilling Major Hargrove's preservation intention beyond mere survival of physical documentation. As noon approached, Margaret joined Professor Whitmore on the farmhouse porch, where the distinguished academic had established regular working location during his monthly research visits. His initial institutional involvement had evolved into personal scholarly commitment extending beyond official university responsibilities, his continuing research developing comprehensive understanding of the material's significance beyond preliminary authentication assessment. The Hargrove Journal continues revealing extraordinary contextual dimensions, Whitmore observed, his tablet displaying transcription of particularly significant passage. His documentation of ethical decision-making under institutional pressure creates unprecedented insight into individual moral agency during systemic conflict. The psychological dimension transcends specific historical period to address fundamental questions about personal responsibility during institutional moral compromise. T2. This scholarly assessment acknowledged significance transcending specific Civil War documentation, addressing universal ethical questions through particular historical example. The material's value extended beyond historical battlefield accounts or military strategy analysis to fundamental human questions about moral choice during conflict, creating relevance connecting 19th century experience to contemporary ethical consideration. His specific references to Augustus Collins suggest relationship beyond professional surveillance interaction, Whitmore continued, indicating documented evidence supporting intentional preservation connection. The journal entries increasingly reference philosophical discussions suggesting deeper connection than operational oversight alone. The deliberate burial location selection appears motivated by personal trust rather than merely convenient concealment. This interpretation strengthened the documented connection between historical materials and Riversbend specifically, confirming relationship beyond coincidental discovery location. The established historical connection had provided foundation for the specialized designation, acknowledging complementary significance between documented historical role and continued agricultural operation, creating integrated preservation framework, rather than conventional historical site conversion. As afternoon activities resumed following midday break, local school buses arrived, delivering students for scheduled educational programming that represented essential component of Riversbend's transformed operations. Unlike conventional historical tourism focused on passive visitation, this educational dimension created active engagement, developing critical thinking skills through direct primary source interaction, establishing meaningful impact beyond mere historical interest. The carefully designed programming maintained age-appropriate engagement without compromising historical complexity, introducing younger students to basic concepts through hands-on agricultural activities while engaging older participants with primary source analysis, developing advanced historical understanding. This developmental approach created continuous educational pathway from elementary introduction through advanced university research, establishing comprehensive programming, serving diverse participants rather than narrow historical specialty alone. Margaret observed Emma leading a small group of her classmates through the exhibition area, her confident explanation demonstrating personal connection beyond memorized historical information. The Confederate government claimed unified Southern support, but these documents show organized resistance networks operating throughout Virginia. People like Sarah Mitchell and James Freeman risked everything opposing slavery and secession despite living in Confederate territory. Their stories weren't included in official histories, but survived through these hidden documents. This articulate interpretation demonstrated how the historical materials had influenced contemporary understanding through educational engagement, transforming Emma's historical perspective beyond conventional narratives through direct primary source exposure. The sustainable methods incorporated from the historical documentation actually improved production efficiency while satisfying preservation requirements. The Commission representatives seemed particularly impressed by that operational integration. This agricultural success demonstrated Riversbend's balanced approach, maintaining productive farming operation alongside historical recognition, achieving enhanced production while fulfilling preservation commitments rather than compromising either dimension. The specialized designation had provided resources supporting agricultural continuation through modernization that maintained historical continuity, creating sustainable operation rather than static historical exhibit. The university research team completed preliminary transcription of the Holston County Resistance Network documentation, Marshall added, her academic contribution balancing agricultural assessment with historical programming update. The materials identify over 60 previously undocumented individuals who maintained organized opposition activities throughout the region. The historical implications extend beyond military operations to fundamental revision of civilian experience understanding during the conflict period. This continuing research demonstrated Riversbend's significance beyond initial discovery excitement, establishing sustained scholarly value through ongoing documentation analysis rather than temporary historical interest. The material's historical importance had been enhanced rather than diminished through comprehensive examination, confirming initial assessment while revealing additional dimensions requiring extended scholarly engagement. The educational programs reached maximum capacity for the third consecutive month, Reynolds reported, completing the operational assessment with programming evaluation balancing agricultural and research updates. The teacher certification workshops have waiting lists through next semester. The Commission specifically noted the community impact metrics exceeding program projections by substantial margins. This educational success confirmed Riversbend's community significance beyond academic research value, establishing meaningful public engagement through programming that transformed historical understanding beyond specialized scholarly interest. The integrated approach connecting local schools, regional universities, and community organizations created comprehensive educational impact, ensuring the historical materials influenced contemporary understanding rather than merely preserving isolated historical documentation. As the gathering transitioned to planning tomorrow's integrated operations, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had evolved from desperate agricultural necessity to comprehensive model balancing historical significance. With continued farming operations, the discovery that had emerged from the eastern field had catalyzed innovative approach, preserving both dimensions through integration rather than compromise, creating sustainable future honoring historical legacy through continued productive stewardship. Later that evening, after ensuring her children had completed homework and settled into normal household routines despite their home's enhanced historical significance, Margaret stepped onto the farmhouse porch, alone, seeking quiet reflection. As evening settled over the property, the October sunset illuminated Rivers Bend's transformed landscape, productive agricultural fields, alongside thoughtfully integrated historical elements, working farm buildings complemented by educational facilities, living continuation rather than static preservation. The eastern field, where desperate ploughing had revealed historical materials, now embodied both agricultural productivity and historical significance, its current cultivation representing continuous stewardship connecting Augustus Collins's establishment through generations of family farming to present operations. The document's emergence had preserved this continuity, rather than converting productive agricultural land to static historical site, maintaining living connection through continued farming operations rather than merely commemorating past activities. As darkness settled across the property, lights from the historical center created gentle illumination, marking location where researchers continued evening documentation work. The renovated barn's carefully designed lighting provided necessary research capability, while respecting agricultural aesthetics, symbolic representation of the balanced approach, maintaining both dimensions without compromising either authentic identity. Margaret's reflective moment was interrupted by Emma joining her on the porch, her daughter's expression suggesting thoughtful consideration beyond typical teenage concerns. "My history teacher said something interesting today," she began, leaning against the porch railing beside her mother. "She said historical truth finds its way into understanding when people are ready to recognize it, like how these documents stayed hidden until exactly when we needed them most." This philosophical perspective connected Major Hargrove's preservation intention across generations to the document's timely emergence during Rivers Bend's most critical challenge, suggesting purpose beyond coincidence in both their concealment and discovery. The remarkable timing, historical materials emerging precisely when their revelation might prevent the farm's loss, created compelling narrative connecting past preservation choice to present continuation through generations of unbroken stewardship. "Maybe that's true," Margaret acknowledged, appreciating her daughter's thoughtful engagement with broader implications beyond practical circumstances. Major Hargrove chose this specific place to preserve these documents during one difficult period, and they emerged generations later when their discovery might help preserve the farm during another challenging time. That connection across time seems meaningful beyond simple coincidence. This shared reflection demonstrated how the historical discovery had influenced their family understanding beyond practical transformation, creating philosophical perspective, connecting their present stewardship with generations of previous caretakers. Through continuing relationship with the land, Rivers Bend represented more than property ownership or agricultural production. It embodied continuous responsibility, connecting past preservation choices with present stewardship through shared commitment transcending individual lifetimes. "I think what matters most is that we're continuing something important," Emma observed with wisdom beyond her 14 years. "Not just farming the land, but preserving the truth about what happened here. People's stories that would have been forgotten are being remembered now because our family kept farming this land all these years." This insight captured the essential connection between agricultural continuation and historical preservation, recognizing complementary rather than competing values that had evolved into Rivers Bend's integrated identity. The farm's continuous Operation had maintained the conditions allowing historical materials to survive until appropriate discovery, while their revelation had provided resources ensuring continued agricultural stewardship rather than property loss, creating mutually sustaining relationship rather than separate considerations. As mother and daughter shared this moment of philosophical reflection, the property around them represented successful integration of historical significance with agricultural continuation, neither sacrificing farming productivity for historical programming nor compromising historical integrity for operational convenience. The specialized designation had provided framework acknowledging both values as essential components, requiring balanced support rather than competing priorities, creating sustainable model preserving authentic identity through continued evolution, rather than static preservation alone. The Eastern Fields' double harvest, agricultural production alongside historical revelation, had transformed Rivers Bend's circumstances through timely discovery, connecting generations of stewardship. Across 150 years of continuous operation, the documents preserved by Major Hargrove during one national crisis had emerged during another critical juncture, providing pathway preserving the farm's agricultural future while acknowledging its historical significance, connecting past preservation, choices to present possibilities through generations of continued stewardship. As Margaret and Emma returned inside to join James in normal evening activities, Rivers Bend Farm continued its dual existence, working agricultural operation and nationally recognized historical site, maintaining authentic identity through balanced integration rather than compromise. The single mother who had desperately plowed fallow fields, seeking financial survival, had discovered historical materials that created innovative preservation pathway, transforming personal crisis into model program demonstrating how agricultural heritage and historical significance could support rather than compete with each other through thoughtful integration, preserving both dimensions for future generations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.